Subscribe to my YouTube channel, share it with your friends, and comment your thoughts. Edward Crane was a man of routine. His life, meticulously structured, revolved around business meetings, negotiations, and the occasional social gathering that filled the calendar of a man in his position. As the founder and CEO of one of the largest tech firms in the world, his world was a symphony of deadlines and deals, a constant hum of success. But today was different. It was a cold morning in early spring. The city streets were bustling, and the wind had a biting edge, the kind that nipped at your skin and made you wish you had worn something warmer. Edward barely noticed the weather as he stepped out of his luxurious penthouse apartment, his tailored coat protecting him from the chill. He had an important meeting that day, one that could seal a deal worth millions, and his mind was already preparing for the day ahead. The streets of the city were as busy as ever. People rushed past him, each caught in their own world, their own plans for the day. The noise of the city, the honking cars, the chatter of pedestrians, it all blurred into the background as Edward walked with purpose, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. He had done this routine 1,000 times before, and nothing ever interrupted it. But that was about to change. As he rounded the corner of a narrow street, something caught his attention. There, on the corner of the bustling square, was a woman sitting on the cold concrete. She was bundled in a tattered coat, her hands extended as she looked up at the people walking past her, hoping for a few coins to get by. But it wasn't just the woman herself that made Edward stop, it was the two children sitting beside her. The children were small, no older than 6 or 7, their faces drawn with exhaustion and hunger. Their clothes were mismatched, their shoes worn down to the soles. They huddled close to their mother, clinging to her as if they were afraid the world might swallow them whole. Edward's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the children that had caught his attention, though they were a heartbreaking sight. It was the woman's eyes. Those eyes. The same eyes he had seen many years ago. The same eyes that had once haunted his dreams. For a brief moment, everything else faded away, the noise of the city, the people around him, the cold wind. It was as if time had stopped, and all that remained was the woman on the pavement, staring at him with an intensity that made him feel like he was being pulled into something far beyond his control. He blinked, his mind scrambling to place her face, to make sense of the sudden rush of recognition that flooded his thoughts. It couldn't be. It was impossible. And yet, there it was, the unmistakable familiarity. The woman's gaze never wavered as she locked eyes with him. Edward stood frozen, his breath coming in shallow gasps. What was happening? Why did she look so familiar? He had seen countless beggars in his life, but there was something about this one, something that tugged at the very core of his being. For years, he had buried the memory, locked it away deep inside him. The memory of her, the woman he had once known. A memory of a time when life was simpler, when he had been a different man, before wealth and success had consumed him. The woman's face had been one of the most beautiful he had ever seen. Her smile was warm, her laugh infectious. She had been kind, full of life, and she had cared for him in ways that no one ever had. They had been in love once, long ago. But then, as fate would have it, she had disappeared without a trace, leaving nothing but unanswered questions and a broken heart. Edward had never known what happened to her. She had vanished from his life without explanation. He had searched for her, hired private investigators, but no one could find her. Eventually, he gave up. He had moved on, or at least he had convinced himself that he had. But now, standing before him, was the woman he thought he had lost forever. His pulse quickened as he took a hesitant step forward. The beggar's eyes never left him, and in that moment, he knew deep down, that she recognized him too. That unsettling feeling deep in his gut only grew stronger. The woman, despite the dirt on her face, despite the rags she wore, was still the same woman he had once loved. He felt a tightness in his chest as he approached her, his legs moving almost mechanically. This couldn't be real. It had to be some sort of cruel illusion. He hadn't seen her in over a decade. There was no way that it was her. But then she spoke. Edward? The sound of his name, spoken in a voice he hadn't heard in years, made his heart skip a beat. It was a whisper, barely audible over the noise of the crowd, but it was enough to confirm what he had feared. He knelt down in front of her, his hands trembling as he reached out. "Is it really you?" His voice was hoarse, unsure. He couldn't understand how this was possible. She had disappeared without a trace. The woman's face softened, and for a moment, she almost seemed to be looking at him through a veil of sadness and regret. Her eyes welled with tears, and she shook her head as if the weight of the years had finally caught up with her. She looked down at the children who were now clinging to her, and then back up at Edward. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You have to help me." Edward's mind was spinning. What was she saying? Why was she here, like this, on the streets with two children? What had happened to her? The questions came faster than he could process them. The answers, however, seemed just out of reach, shrouded in mystery. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world seemed to fade away once more as Edward tried to make sense of what was happening. The beggar woman had once been a part of his life, a significant part. And now here. She was, reduced to this, a shadow of the woman he had known. But something wasn't right. Why was she here? How had she ended up like this? Why had she never contacted him? The children, still silent, looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. They seemed just as lost as their mother. The situation was surreal, and Edward couldn't make sense of it. But one thing was certain, his life had just changed forever. Edward's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. He had not seen the woman in over a decade, yet, here she was, sitting on the cold pavement with two children, her face as familiar to him as his own reflection. But the circumstances were far from what he had imagined. The years had been cruel to her. What had happened in the years they were apart? The beggar's eyes never wavered from him. She looked broken, worn, as if life had stripped her of everything she once had. Edward's heart twisted. This was not the woman he had loved. Or was it? Was it possible that the woman he had known, full of life, radiant, and full of promise, had fallen so far? "Please," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. "You have to help me. You're the only one who can." Edward knelt in front of her, his mind racing. Help her? He didn't even know where to begin. How could he help someone who had disappeared from his life so suddenly, someone who had seemingly vanished without a trace? And yet, here she was, alive, though living in a way that Edward could never have imagined. He glanced at the children, their faces pale and tired. The younger one, a girl with big, innocent eyes, clung to her mother's side, her small hand gripping the beggar's torn coat. The older boy, around 8 or 9, looked up at Edward with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. Both children were dirty, their clothes ragged, their faces etched with hardship that no child should ever have to bear. "Who are they?" Edward asked, his voice hoarse, almost afraid of the answer. The woman swallowed hard, tears welling up in her eyes. She turned her gaze away, unable to answer at first. Edward could see the weight of years of sorrow and hardship in her face. It was as though she had been holding a secret for so long, but now, with him standing there, she had no choice but to let it out. "They're mine," she said quietly, her voice breaking. "My children." Edward stared at her, the words echoing in his mind. His first instinct was to ask more, to question her further, but he could see the pain in her eyes. The sorrow was too much for her to bear. He couldn't push her any further. Instead, he sat in silence, waiting for her to continue, praying that she would find the strength to explain. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke again, her voice shaky. "I don't know where to begin," she murmured. "But I need to. I need you to understand. Edward felt his heart race. This was no ordinary story. He had always known there was more to her disappearance than he had been told, but the truth was something he wasn't prepared for. I don't know what happened to me, she began, her voice growing distant. One minute, I was living the life I always dreamed of. I had everything, friends, a future, a love that made me feel like I could conquer the world. And then, one day, it was all taken from me. And I didn't know why. Edward's throat tightened as he listened. Her words were like a veil, hiding the truth but revealing just enough to make him realize how deep her pain went. It wasn't long after you and after you left, she continued, I found myself alone, pregnant with our child. But I wasn't just carrying one child. I was carrying two. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't even know how to tell myself. And then. Her voice faltered, the weight of her confession heavy in the air. Edward's heart skipped a beat. She had been pregnant when he had last seen her. But she was never alone. She had always had a future, a family. And then. Then what? Edward whispered. Her eyes darted to the children, her hands trembling as she clasped them to her chest. I don't know how it happened. One day, I was leaving the house to go to the store, and when I came back, everything was gone. My apartment. My job. My friends. They all vanished. And so did I. It was like no one knew who I was anymore. I couldn't find help. I couldn't find anyone who cared. And then, I had no choice but to live like this. The streets became my home, and I became someone I didn't recognize. Edward felt his breath catch in his chest. She had been left with nothing, no answers, no way out. She had been robbed of everything. But how? How could something like this happen? How had a life that had seemed so full of promise, of love and happiness, turned into a nightmare? He could see the pain in her eyes, the anguish of someone who had lost more than she could bear. But there was more to the story. There had to be. Who did this to you? Edward asked, his voice shaking with frustration. He needed answers. He needed to know what had happened to her. She shook her head slowly, tears streaming down her face. I don't know, she whispered. But I think I do. I think someone wanted to make me disappear. And now, I think they're after my children. Edward's mind raced. Someone wanted her gone. Someone had taken everything from her, erased her from the life she had once known. And now, they were targeting her children. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture was still blurry. What had happened? Who was behind this? Before he could ask another question, the woman looked at him with pleading eyes. Please, she said, her voice trembling. You have to help me. I don't know how much longer we can survive like this. They're coming for us, Edward. I can feel it. Edward felt his chest tighten as a cold shiver ran down his spine. The weight of her words settled in his mind. They were being hunted. Someone wanted them gone. He looked down at the children, their innocent faces looking up at him with trust, but also with fear. They were in danger. And he had to protect them. But how? Edward stood up, his mind made up. I'll help you, he said firmly. I promise you. I'll help you and your children. But we need to get out of here. We need to go somewhere safe. The woman's face lit up with a mixture of relief and disbelief. She had given up hope. But now, she had a chance. A chance at survival. A chance to protect her children and, perhaps, to unravel the truth of what had happened to her all those years ago. Edward reached out his hand, offering it to the woman. It was a gesture that symbolized everything they were about to face, a new beginning, a new chapter. Come with me, he said softly. I will help you find the answers. together. The woman hesitated for a moment, then took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone who had been living on the streets for so long. As they stood together, the cold wind swirling around them, Edward couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of something far greater. Something dangerous. Something filled with secrets and lies. The truth was waiting to be uncovered. But Edward had no idea just how deep the rabbit hole would go. The air in the car felt thick with tension as Edward and the woman, whose name was now revealed to be Emma, sat in silence. The sound of the engine hummed steadily as Edward navigated the unfamiliar route through the city. The streets seemed to blur past them, a world outside that was no longer relevant to the whirlwind of questions and emotions swirling in Edward's mind. Emma sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed out of the window. The weight of the situation was clearly bearing down on her, and Edward could see the exhaustion in her face, as though she hadn't slept in days. She had told him her story, part of it, anyway. But there was still so much that didn't make sense. Why had she been abandoned? Who was after her and why? And what did they want with her children? Edward had tried asking more questions, but Emma had become guarded, hesitant to reveal too much. She had been through so much already, he could see that, and perhaps she feared that telling him everything would bring even more danger. But the answers were still out of reach, and it gnawed at him. He glanced at her again. "Emma," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to trust me. I want to help you, but I need to know everything. The whole truth. If we're going to figure this out, we have to start from the beginning." She took a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling slowly. "I know," she said, her voice almost breaking. I never wanted you to get involved. I never wanted anyone to know." Edward's heart sank. He could feel her reluctance, her pain. He had heard that kind of fear before, the kind that came from being hunted, from being forced to live in the shadows, always looking over your shoulder. The kind of fear that paralyzed you, made you close up, shut down, and try to survive in silence. "I'm already involved, Emma," Edward said firmly. "I've seen too much to walk away now." For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, finally, she turned to him, her eyes meeting his, filled with a mixture of fear, hope, and something else he couldn't quite place. "I never wanted you to know, Edward. I never wanted you to see me like this. But you have to understand, this isn't just about me. This is about my children. And about a secret that could destroy everything." Edward's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when the past would collide with the present, when everything would finally make sense. "Tell me," he urged, leaning forward, his voice steady. "What secret? What happened to you all those years ago?" Emma's eyes fluttered shut for a moment, as if bracing herself to relive the worst moment of her life. She took a long breath and began speaking in a low, almost haunted voice. "It started with a man. A man I met years ago, before everything fell apart." She paused, her face clouding with a distant, almost sorrowful look. "He was charming, handsome, someone who made me feel seen. His name was Marcus. We met at a party, an exclusive one that I had no business attending. But somehow, I ended up there. He was everything I thought I wanted. Smart, successful, charismatic. He seemed perfect." Edward didn't interrupt, though his mind raced as Emma continued her tale. "We spent months together, and everything seemed wonderful. I was in love, or so I thought. He had connections, power, things I didn't understand back then. He always seemed to know people in high places, and he would take me to places I had never been before, places I thought only existed in movies. At first, I was swept up in the excitement. But then, something changed." Emma's voice faltered for a moment, and she wiped away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. "He started to pull away. It wasn't sudden, but over time, he became distant. I couldn't figure out what was happening. He stopped calling, stopped showing up. I would hear rumors about him, things I didn't want to believe. But then I found out I was pregnant. And when I told him... Emma's voice trailed off, and she shook her head as if the memory was too painful to continue. Edward's heart ached for her. He could see where this was heading, but he didn't interrupt. He needed to know everything. He disappeared, Emma whispered. Just vanished. No calls, no messages. No sign of him anywhere. And then, a few months later, I found out the truth. I wasn't just pregnant with one child. I was carrying twins. And that's when everything started to fall apart. My life, my dreams, everything, started to unravel. My friends disappeared. My family, they didn't believe me when I tried to tell them what had happened. I didn't even know what happened. I was alone. She wiped her eyes again, trying to regain her composure. I thought it was just some weird coincidence. But then, months later, I found out. Marcus wasn't who he said he was. He was involved in something much darker. Something dangerous. And he had a reason for disappearing. He wasn't just avoiding me, he was running from something. And when I found out about it, when I started asking questions, that's when they came for me. Edward listened, captivated by the pain and fear in her words. He could see the fear on her face now, the kind that came from knowing too much, and yet not knowing enough. "Who came for you?" he asked gently, his voice barely audible. Emma looked away, staring out the window again, her fingers clutching the seat in front of her. "I don't know their names. But they are powerful, Edward. And they will stop at nothing to silence me. They have people in every corner of the world, people who can make anyone disappear. They have ties to the highest levels of power, money, and influence. Marcus was just the tip of the iceberg. And when I found out what he was really involved in, when I started digging deeper, they came for me. They came for my children." Edward's stomach churned as her words sank in. The realization that Emma wasn't just some victim of circumstance, it was something much bigger. There were people out there, lurking in the shadows, who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. "How do you know all this?" he asked, his voice tense. "I followed the trail," she said quietly, her eyes haunted by memories of the past. "I knew I couldn't just let it go. I couldn't pretend nothing had happened. I couldn't live with the guilt. I thought if I just got the truth out there, if someone could hear me, maybe I could save my children. But they've been after me ever since. And now, Edward, they know I'm still alive. And they'll do anything to make sure the truth never comes out." Edward's mind was racing. This wasn't just a simple case of a woman who had fallen into hard times. This was a web of deceit, power, and corruption that spanned far beyond anything he could have imagined. And now, he was tangled in it. "Do you have any idea who they are?" Edward asked, though he knew the answer. Emma shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No. But I know they are close. Closer than I'd like to admit." Edward's thoughts whirled. He couldn't shake the feeling that something far bigger than Emma and her children was at play here. Whoever these people were, they weren't going to stop until they had silenced her. And now, they had their sights set on him too. Suddenly, the car swerved, and Edward's heart skipped a beat. Ahead of them, a dark figure stepped into the road, causing him to slam on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt just inches from the man. Edward's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the man who had appeared out of nowhere. The man was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his face obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. He stood there, unmoving, staring directly at Edward through the windshield. "Who the hell is that?" Edward muttered under his breath. But Emma's face went pale. "Get out of here, now," she screamed, her voice filled with panic. Before Edward could react, the man stepped forward, his hand reaching for something at his side. Edward's heart raced as the dark figure stepped closer, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. The air inside the car seemed to close in on them, the sound of Emma's sharp breaths filling the otherwise tense silence. Edward's mind was spinning, but he couldn't afford to hesitate. There was no time to think. No time to wonder who this man was or what he wanted. "Emma, what's happening?" Edward's voice was filled with urgency, but Emma's eyes were wide with terror. She had already unbuckled her seatbelt and was reaching for the door. "Drive, Edward. Now," she yelled, her voice cracking. She grabbed his arm with a strength he hadn't expected from someone who had been living on the streets. "They're here. They've found us." Before Edward could react, she shoved him aside, her hand on the wheel, and jerked it hard, steering the car into a sharp turn. The tires squealed as they skidded across the pavement. Edward's head slammed against the window, but the force of the turn kept him from falling into unconsciousness. The man in the road, the dark figure, was momentarily left behind as the car sped through the narrow streets, weaving in and out of traffic. The world outside the car was a blur of flashing lights, street signs, and chaotic movement. Edward's heart hammered in his chest as the city whizzed past him. He could hear Emma's ragged breathing beside him, and her hands gripped the wheel with a white-knuckled intensity. "Who was that?" Edward managed to gasp. "What do they want?" Emma's face was pale, her eyes darting nervously between the road and the rearview mirror. "I don't know. But they're not just looking for me, Edward. They're looking for my children. And anyone who's in the way." "Why? What do they want with your kids?" Edward's voice was trembling, his mind racing with a million possibilities. What kind of people could be after innocent children? "They're part of the reason," Emma said softly, her voice filled with fear. "They don't just want me. They want my children because they are the key. They hold the answers to everything I was never meant to know." Edward stared at her in confusion. "Answers to what?" Emma hesitated, her grip tightening on the wheel. "To the secrets Marcus was hiding. The secrets he was involved in. The ones that could bring down the entire system." Edward's pulse quickened. The system. The words echoed in his mind, but they made no sense. What system? Who was Marcus really? And why had Emma's children become part of some larger, darker scheme? The questions piled up in his mind as he glanced nervously at the rearview mirror. The dark figure from before was gone, but the threat still felt very real. Emma was right. They weren't just running from a man. They were running from something much bigger, a force with the power to destroy everything. "Where are we going?" Edward asked, his voice tight. He couldn't take much more of this. The danger, the uncertainty, it was all consuming him. "Somewhere safe," Emma replied, her eyes now focused solely on the road ahead. "Somewhere they won't find us. I have a place." Edward looked at her, his confusion growing. "Why do you trust me?" he blurted out, suddenly aware that they were in this together now, whether he liked it or not. "You don't know me. You barely even know my name. Why tell me everything? Why not keep running alone?" Emma's face softened for a moment, but her eyes remained filled with pain. "Because you're the only one who can help me, Edward. You're the only one who has the power to stop this. You're the only one who can protect us." Her voice shook, her fear palpable. "I've tried to fight this alone for too long. But I'm tired. I'm scared. I don't know who to trust anymore." Edward's heart ached as he looked at her, a woman who had been through so much yet was still standing. She was broken, but there was a quiet strength within her, something that told him she had survived far worse than he could imagine. "I'm not a hero," he said softly. "I don't know how to fight people like this. I've spent my life behind a desk, running a company, making deals. I don't even know who these people are. Emma's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was a shared understanding between them. You don't have to be a hero, she said, her voice steady. You just need to help me expose the truth. The words hung in the air, and Edward felt a weight settle in his chest. What truth? What was the truth that Emma was so desperate to uncover? The road stretched out ahead of them, dark and empty. The car sped on, and Edward knew they didn't have much time. Whoever had been after them, whoever the dark figure was, wasn't going to stop until they found them. Emma turned the wheel sharply again, taking another winding road that led them out of the city. The buildings faded into the distance, and the trees of a thick forest began to close in on them. They were heading into the unknown. Edward had no idea where they were going, but he knew that they were on the run, with nowhere to hide. Minutes passed in silence, each one stretching longer than the last. The car finally came to a stop in front of an old farmhouse, the kind that looked abandoned, its paint peeling and the windows darkened. Emma's eyes scanned the area, and she quickly turned to Edward. Stay close. And stay quiet. We can't trust anyone here. Edward didn't question her. He followed her as she led the way to the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Every step felt like they were walking into a trap, but he couldn't turn back now. There was too much at stake. Inside, the farmhouse was cold and dark, the air thick with dust. Emma moved with purpose, heading straight for a door at the back of the house. She opened it and gestured for him to follow her inside. As Edward stepped through the door, he was immediately hit by a sense of unease. The room was small, filled with old furniture and boxes piled high. But it was the walls that caught his attention. There were papers taped to them, maps, photos, newspaper clippings, everything pinned together with strings crisscrossing between them. It was like something out of a detective movie. But this was real. And it was terrifying. Emma turned to him. This is where I've been putting the pieces together, she said quietly. The truth is here, Edward. Everything I've been trying to uncover. And now, I need you to help me finish it. Edward's eyes scanned the room, taking in the evidence, the chaos, the madness of it all. It was as if Emma had spent years piecing together a puzzle, but the final pieces were still missing. What's this all about, Emma? Edward asked, his voice heavy with both disbelief and awe. What truth are you trying to uncover? Emma took a deep breath and walked over to the largest map, a map of the city. It was covered in pins, each marking a location, each connected to a string. I've been tracking Marcus, and his connections, she explained. There's a network of people involved in something huge. They're involved in money laundering, human trafficking, illegal arms trading. And Marcus was at the center of it all. He wasn't just some businessman, Edward. He was a puppet master, pulling strings in the background, making deals that no one knew about. Edward's mind raced as he tried to process her words. This was bigger than anything he had imagined. This was about corruption on a massive scale. This was about power, greed, and a web of lies that stretched far beyond anything he had ever known. Why were you involved? Edward asked, his voice low, almost afraid of the answer. I wasn't, Emma said, shaking her head. But my children, they are. They're part of it. I didn't know until it was too late. Edward's blood ran cold. The children were involved in this. And now, they were in danger. There was no turning back. The truth was out there, and it was waiting to be uncovered. But as Emma had said, they weren't the only ones searching for it. The air in the farmhouse was thick with tension, and every breath Edward took felt like a burden. He stood motionless, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the clutter of maps, documents, and photographs pinned to the walls. Emma was moving around the room, her movements quick and purposeful, but there was a subtle exhaustion about her, as if she had been carrying this burden alone for far too long. Edward couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to something much bigger than they had ever anticipated. The puzzle pieces Emma had been collecting were forming a picture, but the more he saw, the more overwhelming it became. The strings connected names, dates, and locations. People he had never heard of, places he couldn't imagine, all tied together by a web of lies, deception, and a shadowy underworld that seemed to govern everything. Emma, he began cautiously, trying to find his voice through the thick fog of confusion. What exactly are we looking for here? I mean, what is all this? Why did Marcus get involved in all this stuff? Emma paused, her back to him. She didn't turn around, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she was clenching her fists as if trying to control the emotions that were bubbling up inside her. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and steady. Marcus was never just a businessman. He was part of something much bigger, something that no one was supposed to know about. He wasn't just laundering money or trafficking weapons. He was involved in controlling information, blackmail, coercion, manipulation. The people he worked for, they didn't just want money or power. They wanted control over everything. Over governments, over businesses, over people's lives. Edward's mind raced. It sounded like a conspiracy theory straight out of a spy thriller. But everything Emma had said so far had been real. She wasn't lying. And now, as he looked at the maps and documents on the wall, he knew there was more to this than anyone could have guessed. Where do I fit into all this? He asked, though he was afraid of the answer. Why did Marcus come after me? Why did he keep coming back into your life? Emma turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, he saw something in them, something vulnerable, something raw. Because of your company, she said quietly. Because of you, Edward. They needed you. They needed access to your resources, your influence. You were a piece of the puzzle they were trying to put together. Edward felt his heart stop for a moment. My company? But I didn't know anything about any of this. I've been running a business, Emma. I've been building something legitimate. I've stayed out of all of this. I know, Emma whispered. I know you didn't know. But they've been watching you for a long time. Watching everything. Marcus was the bridge. He needed you to get close to the people who could give him access to the information and the resources he needed. But when you walked away from him, when you got too far from the people he was working with, that's when they started to come after you. And after me. Edward's mind reeled. The implications of what Emma was saying were staggering. He had been a part of something bigger, something dark, without even knowing it. And now, everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was in jeopardy. I don't understand, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. If they needed me, why didn't they just come for me directly? Why all this with you and your children? Emma's expression darkened. She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for something even more painful to reveal. They didn't just want you, Edward. They wanted your children too. They wanted to control everything. The moment Marcus disappeared, they lost their access to the information they wanted, and that's when they turned their sights on me and my kids. I didn't know what I had gotten myself into. I thought I was just in a relationship with a powerful man. But he was using me. Using us all. Edward felt the weight of her words settle on his chest like a heavy stone. He didn't know how to respond. It felt like the ground beneath him had shifted, like everything he had known to be true was now falling apart. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? Edward asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Why did you keep it all a secret? I couldn't, Emma said, her voice cracking. I couldn't trust anyone. I couldn't even trust myself. I didn't know who I was anymore. But I knew I had to protect my children. And I knew that if I brought you into this, it would put your life in danger. I didn't want that for you. Edward's heart softened as he saw the pain in her eyes. He had never imagined the kind of fear she had lived with every single day. It was a fear that had kept her in hiding, kept her away from the people who might have been able to help. It was a fear that had isolated her, made her a prisoner of her past. "Where are the children now?" Edward asked softly, his eyes never leaving hers. Emma's face fell, and she glanced nervously at the door. "I don't know," she whispered. "They're gone. They took them. They came for them last night. They knew I was here. I couldn't stop them." Edward's heart lurched in his chest. "They took them? Who? What are you talking about?" Emma's hand shook as she reached for the map on the wall, pulling it down with trembling fingers. She unrolled it, revealing a network of locations marked with red pins, all connected by strings of varying lengths. "They came in the middle of the night," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard the footsteps outside. I knew it was them. I tried to protect them, but they were too fast. They took my children, and they left a message. They want me to come to them. They want me to give them what they want. But I can't do that, Edward. I can't." Edward's stomach dropped. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Emma was in deeper than he had ever imagined. And now her children were in the hands of these people, these shadowy figures who were willing to do anything to get what they wanted. He stepped forward, his hands on her shoulders. "We're going to get them back," he said. With resolve. "I don't care what it takes. We're going to find your children, and we're going to bring them home." Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "You don't understand, Edward. They're not just after my children. They're after me. And once they get me, they'll destroy everything." Edward's mind was racing. He needed to think. He needed a plan. But right now, there was no time for hesitation. The clock was ticking. The longer they waited, the more danger Emma's children were in. He turned to the map on the wall, studying the locations, his mind working quickly. "These places on the map," he said, "they're all connected to Marcus, aren't they? These are the people who are after us." Emma nodded. "Yes. But you don't know who they are, Edward. These are dangerous people. They have connections everywhere. If we go to the wrong place, they'll kill us both. Then we need to be smart about it," Edward said, his voice firm. "We'll go to the places they don't expect us. We'll follow the trail, piece by piece, and we'll get your children back. But we need to move quickly. And we need to be prepared for anything." Emma's face softened, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "I can't do this without you, Edward. I need you." Edward nodded, his jaw clenched with determination. "You won't have to. We're in this together. And we're not leaving without your children." The plan was simple, but it was also dangerous. They would follow the trail Marcus had left behind, piece together the information they needed, and hopefully find Emma's children before it was too late. But time was running out. And the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous their pursuit would become. The only question left was whether they would survive long enough to uncover it. The silence that filled the farmhouse was deafening. Edward could hear the faint rustling of Emma's breath as she prepared herself for the inevitable. There was no more time to second-guess their choices or wonder about the risks, they had already come too far. The only option now was to press forward, no matter the consequences. Edward glanced over at Emma, who was standing by the map on the wall, her eyes scanning the locations they had marked. He could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that had been there from the beginning, but now it was tinged with something else, determination. She had come to terms with the fact that whatever happened next would change everything, and she wasn't going to back down. "We can't keep running, Emma," Edward said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "We need to face this head-on. The longer we wait, the more danger your children are in." Emma nodded, her hands shaking slightly as she traced a finger over the map. "I know. But I don't know if we're ready. These people, they're powerful. If we go in without a plan, they'll kill us." Edward's jaw clenched as he thought about the people they were up against, the shadowy figures who had been pulling the strings for so long, the ones who had orchestrated everything from the beginning. They had taken Emma's children. They had manipulated Marcus and countless others into playing their parts in a game that had affected thousands of lives. But now, it was their turn to expose the truth. "We don't have a choice," Edward said firmly, his eyes locking with Emma's. "We go in with everything we've got. And we don't stop until we have your children, and we've brought these people to justice." Emma's gaze softened as she looked at him. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, something like hope. She had been through so much, and yet, in this moment, she wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in a long time, she had someone who believed in her, someone who was willing to stand by her side, no matter the cost. "All right," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "Let's finish this." The two of them quickly gathered their things, preparing for what they knew would be the most dangerous part of their journey. The farmhouse was no longer safe, and they couldn't afford to waste any more time. The location they needed was just a few miles away, and Emma was certain that if they didn't act now, they would lose everything. Her children, her life, everything they had fought for, it would all be gone. Edward turned to her, his mind still racing. "What's the plan? Where do we start?" Emma's eyes flickered with determination as she pulled out a set of keys from her pocket. "We're going to an old facility outside the city. It's where they've been hiding out. It's where they've been keeping my children. They'll be there." Edward's heart thudded in his chest. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but the thought of facing those people, of confronting the ones who had torn apart Emma's life, was almost too much to bear. He didn't know how they were going to pull this off. But he couldn't back out now. "Let's do it," he said, his voice unwavering. The drive was tense, and the silence between them was heavy. Emma's eyes were fixed on the road ahead, while Edward's mind was flooded with questions. How had it all gone so wrong? How had Marcus, a man he had trusted, turned into a puppet for such a dark and dangerous force? And what was it that Emma's children held, the key that made them so important? As they neared their destination, Emma's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "This is it," she whispered. "This is where they'll be." Edward's stomach turned as they pulled off the main road and onto a secluded dirt path that led deeper into the woods. The facility loomed ahead, an old, abandoned building that had once been used for industrial purposes. It was now a hidden fortress, one that housed the secrets of the most dangerous people Emma had ever encountered. The facility was dark and silent, its windows covered in grime and dirt. The only sound was the crunching of gravel beneath the tires as they pulled into a small clearing near the entrance. Emma stopped the car, and for a moment, they both sat in silence, staring at the building ahead. "You ready?" Emma asked quietly. Edward nodded, his heart racing. "Let's go." They exited the car cautiously, each step bringing them closer to the unknown. Edward could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just a rescue mission. This was a fight for survival. For justice. For the truth. As they approached the entrance, Emma led the way, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard. This place was full of secrets, and the people inside it would stop at nothing to protect them. They reached the door, and Emma paused for a moment. "This is where it all ends," she said softly, more to herself than to Edward. Edward placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a silent reassurance. "We're not backing down now." With a deep breath, Emma turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room inside was dimly lit, the air thick with dust. They moved quickly, cautiously, through the dark hallway, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The building was abandoned, but the faint sounds of movement in the distance sent a chill down Edward's spine. They weren't alone. "Where do we go from here?" Edward whispered, his eyes scanning the hallway. "There's a room at the end of this corridor," Emma replied. "That's where they're keeping the children. We need to be quiet." They continued down the hallway, moving with purpose, until they reached a large steel door at the end. Emma hesitated for a moment, then nodded to Edward, signaling that they were ready. Edward could feel his heart in his throat as he silently pushed open the door. Inside, the room was dark, save for a single dim light overhead. The children were there, just as Emma had said. Sitting on the floor, looking scared and confused. But as soon as they saw Emma, their faces lit up with relief. "Mom," the younger girl cried, her voice trembling. Emma rushed forward, gathering her children into her arms. "I'm here, baby. I'm here." Edward stood back, his heart heavy as he watched the reunion unfold. It was a bittersweet moment, one that was long overdue, but one that came with its own set of dangers. They were far from safe. The people who had taken Emma's children were still out there, and they were coming for them. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them. Edward's heart skipped a beat, and he turned to see several men emerge from the shadows, their faces cold and menacing. They were dressed in black, their eyes hidden behind dark glasses. "So, you found them," one of the men said, his voice low and threatening. "But it's too late. You should have stayed out of this, Emma. Now, you'll pay the price." Edward stepped forward, his fists clenched. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Emma stood protectively in front of her children, her eyes filled with defiance. "We're not going anywhere with you. You can't control us anymore." The man chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "You think you can stop us? You're nothing. Just a broken woman, hiding from the truth." Edward's mind raced. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. They had to fight. They had to survive. Suddenly, Emma lunged forward, knocking the man off balance. Edward took the opportunity to rush at the others, his adrenaline fueling every move. A fight broke out, fast and brutal. Edward could feel the weight of every punch, every kick, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not with Emma's children in danger, not with the truth just within reach. After what felt like an eternity, the last of the men fell to the ground. Edward stood panting, his chest heaving. He turned to Emma, who was kneeling beside her children, her face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "It's over," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's finally over." Edward took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. But as the adrenaline began to wear off, he realized that their fight wasn't over. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. There were still secrets to uncover, people to bring to justice, and a world that needed to hear the truth. And in the quiet of that abandoned facility, with Emma's children safe and the people who had hurt them finally defeated, Edward knew one thing for certain: the fight for justice was just beginning. Wait for next part. Thank you.